Today on Public Research, is the two-state solution dead? Will the Palestinians ever accept Israel? Is settlement expansion in the West Bank what's preventing peace?
Of course, Palestinians wish Israel didn't exist. Are they willing to come to terms with Israel, or are they gonna, fight until the death against Israel? That's the difference, I think, between, Palestinians who join Hamas and Palestinians who don't join Hamas. And what she's trying to do is she's trying to conflate them. They're all the same. If they have this fundamental belief that, Israel is illegitimate, then that's what we have to defeat. We have to re-educate them. We have to fight them. And so what she's basically saying is, like, we have to view them as one kind of solid, unified Palestinianism. And that serves Hamas's interest.
We talked to Israeli-American writer and peace activist Benzion Sanders about the West Bank, settlement expansion, Israel, October 7th, Fatah, Hamas, and the true prospects for a two-state solution. So my views are totally against the settlement expansions. The settler violence stuff is just a total disgrace.
Yeah.
It's outrageous. My view on the war was that the goal of destroying Hamas was stupid, and that they should just try to disarm Hamas and just taken the Rafah crossing and said, we're just going to stop the weapons and smuggling, and then just said to Hamas, hey, fire your rockets, because those are your last rockets. Which is extremely dovish compared to, what...
Compared to what happened.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so that's interesting.
I always say this, I'm a learner. I'm in no position to say this is the correct stance and these is wrong.
Got it.
How solid are your views versus how floating are they? For instance, for me, my views on Israel-Palestine stuff are almost always constantly shifting. The ground is sort of shifting. For you, is the ground not shifting that much? Or are you still changing your mind on core issues?
Interesting question. I think I kind of heard almost two questions in the question that you asked, because you asked about views shifting and you asked about ground shifting, and or at least that's what I heard. I think in some ways, my view of the conflict has kind of I'm always open to hearing different kind of perspectives, but I've been involved in the conflict directly as I joined the IDF very shortly after I came to Israel for the first time, within a few years. And I served in the West Bank. I served in the Gaza Strip in 2014 and had these pretty intense experiences, enforcing the kind of day-to-day, settlement expansion and friction between IDF settlers and Palestinians who are kind of under this military rule. And then being in the war in Gaza against Hamas, to defeat Hamas or to weaken Hamas or to eliminate the threat that Hamas posed, and then to come back and just to see that the Israeli government is kind of not only not defeating Hamas but actually propping up Hamas. So like just that experience of like somebody who like was sent to risk their lives to fight Hamas, and then to turn around and see kind of the Israeli government just kind of like prop them up and be like, oh, actually, we really want to perpetuate the conflict because, having these terrorist groups, in control of large parts of Palestinian territories actually serves our interests, because we actually care about primarily expanding the settlement project and taking over more land, and having Hamas in control or a looming threat even over, taking over the West Bank. It's convenient because it provides us with an alibi, for not uh, for not moving towards a compromise, a territorial compromise, which is the greatest threat. So that like basic understanding that that's kind of what's at play, and that's what the people in power have wanted for so many years, and the belief that has been kind of substantiated based on so much research and so many conversations that uh, you know, I've had and I've heard by the highest level across the board of the Israeli security establishment, and really comparing it to so many conflicts around the world that I, learned about. Like, people don't like it when you deny them rights, deny them self-determination, deny them, the same type of fulfillment that I get as an Israeli, as a Jewish person, when I think about, that we have a country, Israel, and we're the masters of our own destiny, and we have this whole historical narrative, and it's meaningful, and people and Jews around the world connect to that. So of course Palestinians want that too, and that's especially true when it's being denied, and they're being, kicked out of their homes, and they're being, pushed around for generations. And so it's clear to me, so in like the fundamental sense, that like the way for Israel to kind of um mitigate and work towards winding down this many generations of conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is territorial compromise based on international law, based on a two-state solution. That's something that's like very kind of firm, and it's not something that that I'm not against hearing different arguments. I'm constantly like reading different takes on how viable, what the way to get there is. Are there alternative, arrangements that could work? But at a fundamental level, like, that is something that I don't like wake up in the morning every day or every week and be like, like, is that,
Right.
so in that sense, I think like those views are pretty solidified for me. On the other hand, like, a lot of people, when they're talking about this, like, are sure about like what's going to happen next. And I really don't know. You know, you see trends, you see like the settlements expanding, and you see things happening, and people are predicting doom and gloom, and people are very confident in kind of their kind of forecast for how things are going. And I feel like some days I feel incredibly pessimistic, and some days I feel like, there's a chance that something might work, and it's just so unpredictable. And that's kind of what keeps me going, is because I don't feel like anything is set in stone in terms of like the ground, the reality as is unfolding. I feel like my kind of view as to like where things are going at any given moment is definitely fluid, and it's informed by, all sorts of international developments, and developments within the conflict in the Palestinian society and political world, and obviously informed by the Israeli political developments in Israel.
So, like, for instance, if somebody said, like, okay, I'm certain that I support a two-state solution, but I do internally debate topographical, geographic issues with the West Bank having the higher ground, and I worry about, you know, if they can fire a weapon down, I worry about, will that be a problem? Is there like a micro question like that that you internally debate?
Oh, listen, I think that, it's just, those types of issues, I don't debate them as much anymore, because I think that, when from just based on the books I've read, like, or lectures I've been to, or in some cases even in conversations with very senior military strategy people, like, I've shared a lot of kind of my about Ami Ayalon, who was a former head of the Shin Bet, who I've read his book. I've spoken to him. I've listened to dozens of interviews that he's given, but also other former heads of the Mossad and former high-ranking IDF officers and who've written about this. And of course, if there's a Palestinian state on the hills, of the West Bank, of course, it makes it easier in a physical sense for there aren't going to be Israeli troops on the ground that are active in the same way, but to physically stop somebody from going up on a hilltop and firing a mortar round or something like that. But I think what I understand is strategically, the reconciliation, or maybe reconciliation isn't the word, but the kind of resolution of the Palestinian issue is so much more of a strategic benefit to Israel, that the kind of the tactical, could somebody launch a rocket here or there, it really is completely overshadowed. Because at the end of the day, the way I see it, and this is something that I've really taken from Ami Ayalon, who is the head of the Israeli Shin Bet for 4.5 years, responsible, the top counterterrorism official. And I don't know if he uses this kind of metaphor, but the way I see it is really the most dangerous weapon that the Palestinians have against us is not rockets or explosives or guns or anything like that. It's really the hopelessness and the despair that Palestinians feel throughout the territories in Gaza Strip, in the West Bank. And the more despair they feel and the more grievance they have, and just to be clear, I don't think any type of violence against Israeli civilians is ever justified. It's morally abhorrent. However, the grievance that is motivating those terrorist groups are completely legitimate, and that's because those grievances are so strong and so valid and so visceral. Palestinians living under occupation, being denied this autonomy and this self-determination and this dream, it makes it easy for them to recruit, and hopeless, despairing young Palestinian men primarily, who are susceptible for recruitment to these violent terrorist groups. That is the most dangerous, the greatest threat to Israel, because that can completely disrupt and destabilize and threaten the existence of Israel. This terrorism that in my view, we continue to fuel by crushing the hope for an independent Palestinian state. We are fueling terrorism. That's why a diplomatic progress between Israelis and Palestinians has always been considered to be a huge threat to Hamas, and that's why they tried to derail the Oslo process, and that's what countless former IDF intelligence people will say. That's the only threat to Hamas. Hamas is they're selling this kind of this despair. It's like, no, you're never going to get anything through diplomacy. So we have to, it's us or them, and we need to use violence. We need to terrorize them. We need to chase them out. We need to drive them out. Completely unrealistic, but it finds fertile soil in the imaginations of despairing, idealistic, nationalistic young Palestinians who see the failure to make progress on any other track.
Yeah.
So
and
that's really the ability to eliminate that weapon that the terrorist groups have, or that Hamas has, I think outweighs the physical. The idea is, if you eliminate the motivation, if the Palestinians living in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip say, hey, you know, the PLO, the Fatah movement, the Palestinian factions who recognized Israel and said we're willing to live with Israel. We didn't want Israel to come up. We don't accept the legitimacy of the Zionist movement, but we're willing to sign a deal. We're willing to to compromise and to live side by side with the Israelis. They've had nothing to show for themselves, and so that feeds into this much greater threat than whether or not physically we have troops on the ground to stop somebody to go up on the hilltop. The problem is, no matter how many troops you have, no matter how many walls you build, if you have an oppressed people, millions of them, you're never going to be perfect. And it's like you're, I think Netanyahu was quoted in the past, and certainly people within his circle is like, no, like, we know that this is that there's this Palestinian terrorism that's always going to rear its head, but we can control kind of the level of the flame. And I don't think that that's true. I think that you shouldn't play with fire. You really shouldn't play with fire. And as long as we continue to perpetuate this repressive reality, there's that strategic threat of millions of Palestinians who we're oppressing and denying the self-determination. That's a much greater strategic threat than what you're describing of having control over the hilltops.
Yeah, I mean, I've made this point to Israeli guests because I heard a lot of Israelis after October 7th. They'd say, look at the amount of support Hamas has in the West Bank. And I would say to them, exactly your point. Imagine you're an 18-year-old Palestinian in the West Bank and you're just watching this constant settlement expansion. It makes Abbas look like this feckless clown collaborator. So of course they're gonna support the fighters compared to, because you've made Abbas look like a clown who just allows the Israelis to move deeper and deeper into the West Bank. So I totally agree with you on that. I want to get back to the West Bank in a second, but first I want to go back to, you were in Gaza in one of the previous, as they call them, rounds.
Yeah.
Do you ever think about, because this is what surprises me when I look back on it. Israel fought these wars, and I don't understand. Did no one at the time think, wow, we're going in, they have all these tunnels. So clearly they have some kind of digging equipment to make them. They have all these rockets, all these guns. So clearly there's arms smuggling from Egypt. Why don't we just handle that at the Rafah crossing rather than going in and doing these endless rounds? Did anybody think about like doing that instead?
It's an interesting question, and I think that, like, I definitely don't have like the expertise. Like I said, I am interested in this kind of stuff, but mostly from the more like the strategic geopolitical, what should be our Israel's policy on a policy level, not on a kind of a tactical level. Although I will say that, just based on like some following the war and some commentary, um, you know, from what I understand, really the Egyptian border was not the lifeline that it was made out to be, certainly by Netanyahu. Like, you know, the Hamas really, they use these Yasin, 105. Like, I don't a lot of it is like, and a lot of the rockets too, these are not like Russian made rockets that or Russian or Chinese like anti-tank or Iranian anti-tank guided missiles. A lot of these are they're homemade. They had like a weapons manufacturing facility, and actually the fact that such a overwhelming majority of the weapons seized were actually domestically produced is an indication that probably what they were doing is they were smuggling materials in on just these commercial trucks, and it's very hard. It's very hard to be 100% on those things. You just if you have a truck filled with food, you have a truck filled with whatever, you put in a few a few pieces or a few pounds of some kind of material that can be turned into an explosive. So yeah, they had I don't think you know but listen, I think that really at the end of the day, like, again, they pulled this off. It wasn't like they had like sophisticated military gear. It was just it was a complete um strategic deception that they pulled off. They convinced Israel
Oh yeah,
that
yeah,
they
right.
convinced Israel that they weren't interested anymore in fighting. And Israel had like a few hundred troops, a tiny amount of soldiers on incredibly tiny amount of just a few hundred soldiers on the guarding 2 million Palestinians. And so they sent a they caught us completely on our back foot. All of our soldiers, the vast majority of our combat troops are um, you know, in the West Bank, running after settlers. And they just overwhelmed us. There was not like, it wasn't like um even if there was like everything was hermetically sealed, I mean, look in the West Bank. uh you know um I don't think I think that the reason that something like October 7th couldn't happen in the West Bank is not because they couldn't get the weapons. It's not because there isn't that level of ability to manufacture. Like, look at the IEDs that are blowing up in Jenin. Like, they have plenty of explosives there. Maybe they haven't been able to build the manufacturing facilities because the IDF is constantly doing these raids. But if the IDF would like, you know, not go into Jenin for a couple of years, they would be able to manufacture those things based on materials that they smuggle in, even though Israel has complete control over the Jordanian border, but,
I,
you know,
I think though they built such a large tunnel network. Was it over 300 miles in Gaza?
yeah,
Clearly they got some kind of excavator digging equipment into there,
no,
and
these
yeah.
tunnels are very, very narrow. They're not like most of them. I mean, I know that I've seen some big ones, but it was not like heavy machinery. It was just like slave labor.
Oh, really?
Uh,
Okay.
but no, I'm sure that again, I'm not an expert on this, but I don't think that like choking choking off Gaza more would have made a major difference at the end of the day. Because, like I said, I think what October 7th it's a sign of these desperate, depraved, really depraved people, who are this savagery. Like, you look at what happened. I've read Shlomi Eldar. He's a journalist who covered Gaza for so many years. He published something right after October 7th, which was this kind of reflection on a conversation he had like 20 years before, right after not quite 20 years, but right after the Gaza disengagement. Basically, Israel kind of pulled out of the Gaza Strip and kind of like locked the door behind them and threw away the key and imposed basically almost 2 decades of uh, maybe it wasn't really linear, but it was kind of just a deterioration. I mean, even before October 7th, the situation in Gaza was on the precipice of a catastrophe, humanitarian catastrophe. Drinking water, not enough electricity. Every couple of years, these devastating wars, and so I think that like tightening the siege, like it would have just accelerated this process. I mean, the greatest weapon that Hamas has is not digging equipment. It's not the rockets. It's the tens of thousands of orphans, of despairing young men who will sign up to sacrifice their lives to fight against Israel. And that is, you have enough of those. It doesn't matter, you know, they'll find a way. They'll find a way to, to surprise you. You can't be 100% on these things.
I'm trying to get a sense of what percentage of blame. Do you think it's like 100%? If Israel did X, Y, Z, this whole conflict could end in 10 years or 5 years? Or how do you disperse the responsibility percentage wise?
Good question. I think that it's not like an easy question to answer because um you know I can have I can and I do have a lot of criticism for um Palestinian things that are mainstream from my perspective in like Palestinian discourse around the conflict, uh especially the Palestinian solidarity movement abroad, which I think honestly has a huge impact. The same way I see, Jewish pro-Israel lobby, and an evangelical pro-Israel lobby, has a huge impact you know, on the reality here. I look at like the pro-Palestinian, movement in the United States and the people who are doing the advocacy on behalf of the Palestinians, whether in government or on in the streets in college campuses. And I just like Grant, I like it's hard for me to like to I don't want them to become like I get it. They're pro-Palestinian. I feel like they're extremely ineffective, and it's not just a feeling like the I wish they would say different things, not because, I care about them so much, but if I feel like if they were more effective at making a compelling case and be more persuasive as opposed to just, kind of being extremely kind of unrealistic in terms of their expectations and in terms of their rhetoric, and very extreme, and dismissive of kind of like international law and basics, this decolonization discourse. I think it's really unhelpful. But at the end of the day, not that Israel is any what's coming out of the pro-Israel camp is both in the U.S. and in the Israeli government is any worse, is worse or more blameworthy in terms of like the sense that it's more it's unjustifiable. But I think that at the end of the day, Israel is the party to this conflict that has really all the power on the ground to shape reality. Because of the military dominance, like total dominance. So it's not about like guilt, but it's simply a question about control and ability to shape reality. And I think that in that case, Israel has the ability to shape the reality that the Palestinians simply just don't have. And I think that that's true also in terms of influence in Western countries. Um, and again, I think that maybe some of that maybe actually, now that I'm talking it out, because I really don't think about this question so much. Um, maybe if they were more effective in their advocacy, and they were saying, kind of what Palestinian moderates have been saying for such a long time, as opposed to, again, not to, again, I think the Palestinian Authority is extremely corrupt and also oppressive, regime in its own sense. But at the end of the day, like the kind of the line they have on the conflict, the kind of approach they take of, we're willing to live alongside Israel. That's something that I feel like there aren't a lot of voices like that doing the advocacy for Palestinians who will just be respectful of that kind of international law and basic kind of, to me, like a reasonable resolution to the conflict. And I get it, like, Israel has trampled that dream so much that you kind of understand why they're giving up on it. But I think they're making it kind of, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like the more you you make it easier for Israel to make the case that there's no there's no feasibility for it. And again, I know they talk out of both sides of their mouth, because at home they say, well, it's all ours and God gave it to us. And then internationally they'll say, the Hasbara line of like, oh, we tried, we really want to have peace, but there's no partner. Or, the Palestinians are, they just want to throw us into the sea. But there are a lot of Palestinians, and there are official Palestinian leadership in Abbas and many other Palestinian figures who are willing to respect international law and coexist alongside Israel. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, like, Israel is building settlements and undermining a two-state solution in a way that the Palestinian Authority doesn't even have the power to affect the reality one way or the other. And Hamas, Hamas, like, again, like they pulled off October 7th in part because they played such a long game of really, maybe it's because of weakness, but there were many years when Hamas and other terrorist groups didn't really they weren't really active, and they weren't really effective in the late 2000s. Really, for most, besides for the big flare up in 2014, the first half of the 2010s, you have years when there was a few terrorist attacks here and there, but nothing even close to what's become the new normal, even before October 7th. And what happened? Nothing. There was no progress. No progress towards the two-state solution. No progress towards diplomacy. The Palestinian authorities, back in the late 2010s, and really for decades has been helping the IDF suppress terrorism, and they have nothing to show for it. So yeah. Anyway.
I make that same point, and then Israeli did point this out to me, and I realized I had been forgetting it. Some people laugh at it, but Trump did offer what was it called? The deal, Jared Kushner, the deal of the cent. Do you remember this 2017 deal?
Yeah, I remember it.
And
Absolutely.
I think Abbas, he wouldn't even go to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it wasn't it wasn't really you know it was a bit of a joke, like it was basically maintaining the status quo on the West Bank. The only again, I don't remember the details of it that much, but it basically allowed Israel to annex all the settlements to the West Bank. There wasn't a single settlement that would be evacuated. So you have a very fragmented Palestinian state. Um, and like obviously, in order to maintain that reality, that's just an invitation for like, you know, basically military occupation. Uh, so it just didn't seem very serious at the time, and the only thing that they were gonna get was all this like desert in the Negev. They're gonna give them just like this land in the Negev, these little, along the Egyptian border. So it's a bit of a joke. If you look at a map of the settlements were built specifically to make a Palestinian state impossible. And if you travel through the West Bank and you look at or if you study closely a map of the West Bank, you'll see how successful they have been. In some ways, they haven't been successful, and I know that there are people point out like people actually don't really want to go live so much. The communities like really far out deep in the West Bank are not like thriving communities for the most part, but they come in there with barbed wire fences, with surveillance cameras, with heavy military presence, and they embitter the lives of the Palestinians living around them. So any solution, from that perspective, it was kind of a non-starter. It wasn't a serious offer, and again, I don't know.
Right. Sure.
And yeah, so like, listen, they've made it, there have been rounds of negotiations. There have been offers on the table. And they've been like, within like there's like basically, black and white things that everyone agrees will be part of Israel, or will be, given to Israel, will become Israel will apply sovereignty to certain parts of the West Bank in with land swaps. And there are certain settlements under in every round of negotiation. Even the Israeli side to those negotiations will acknowledge that this is going to be outside of the bounds of Israel. This will be in a sovereign Palestinian state. And so, but there's been the gray area where they haven't been able to bridge. And so, to just kind of start and just throw that all out the window and just be like, hey, like, so I don't think it was a serious
Right.
starting point. I don't know.
Right. So this is interesting because I agree with you on the settlements. So I'm always playing your role here. But so let me just play devil's advocate for a second. Let's say Netanyahu in like 2013, he dismantles all the settlements and does the Benzion Sanders policy on settlements in the West Bank. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think happens in Gaza? Does that make Hamas say, "Hey, you know what, we believe in a two-state solution now"?
Listen, it's hard. It's really hard to know exactly what's gonna happen. But
Okay.
let me answer the question though.
Sure.
I think listen, I think probably what would have happened if that was the case in 2013, probably Hamas would have orchestrated a series of terrorist attacks to try to undermine and derail any progress towards a two-state solution, the same way they did in during the Oslo years. They mobilized to derail the Oslo process because they were afraid of a two-state solution. I've heard different analyses of Hamas, and saying that if it was overwhelmingly popular, they would accept the two-state solution. And that end goal is not like something that they're really completely have ruled out. They think the way to get there is different. They think the way to get there is through violence. And like, I don't know, it's really hard for me to
Right, right,
say,
right.
but I think that regardless of what Hamas's ideological flexibility is and whether they could accommodate or not accommodate, the truth of the matter is they're a terrorist organization. And what their end goal is not as important to me uh, as what I think ultimately, if they, I think, and I think that if you track the polling, Palestinian polling over the years, you look at times where it looked like there was more of a feasibility for a two-state solution, then the two-state solution had more support. But when it looked like completely hopeless and you were deeper into successive Israeli governments, and this is the situation we're in now, where they've openly foreclosed on the possibility of there being a two-state solution. So you have more popularity for armed resistance, and just they don't believe that anything else will work. So I think that if Netanyahu would say, we want to start evacuating settlements and start negotiating a peace agreement, and I'm committed to leading Israel in that direction. I think that would reverberate. And if people saw that was serious and that was backed up in action, it wasn't just lip service, maybe a trust building measure could be to start evacuating the settlements that are illegal, not under international law, these settlements that are illegal under Israeli law, the unauthorized outposts. There are hundreds of those in the West Bank, and Israel won't even enforce the law against them. They'll kind of wink and nod, and connect them to electricity and pave them roads and give them benefits and look the other way. And so, if it was serious, I think that would just completely just totally shift the dynamic internally for Palestinians, because the Palestinians who have said, hey, let's pursue diplomacy, hey, let's see if what we can accomplish through negotiations and engagement, and
Will give them
and
credibility. Yeah.
yeah, and so then the armed terrorist groups would they would have to adapt, and they might do it by trying to to derail it through violence, but they also might do it by just losing their relevance and losing their base of support and becoming very unpopular, and and also maybe compromising on their ideology and saying, hey, we don't want to go against the consensus, we're willing to so I mean that's what happened originally with Fatah. Fatah was the terrorist group. They were the one,
Right.
they hijacked planes, they murdered Israeli civilians. In fact, the Israeli Shin Bet had a role in kind of cultivating Hamas in the
Right.
beginning, because they thought, oh, this is going to be some kind of
Right. Right.
alternative to weaken Fatah. So like things change, and again, as much as I abhor terrorism, and I abhor Hamas, and I have literally put my life on the line, and I've had friends and relatives attacked and killed by Hamas. um like, I think that maybe there would be a day that they would change. I think probably it's hard to see that now, but like it we can't even begin to discuss it,
Right.
because right now I think in many ways I understand why they're like vindicated in their approach. Again, it's not moral, it's morally abhorrent, but um, but when they say, hey, we need to use violence um, because nothing else is
Yeah,
working, well, they're
because
right that
with the boss, all
they're
you get is settlement expansion. Right. Exactly. Uh,
exactly. So it's hard to see, it's hard to know what would happen. What would happen to Hamas if Israel would give give the moderate Palestinians, give the PA, give Abbas, give the Fatah movement accomplishments,
Right.
and work with them,
Right.
and so it's really hard to say.
I wanted you to respond to this clip because a lot of people listen to this and they find it very convincing. So this is Annette Wilf.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm just going to play this. I want you to respond.
So President Biden comes here and he describes the evil that was unleashed on that day. But then he goes on to say, but Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. He wants to keep them pristine. And Israel succumbed to that and agreed to play along with the lie. And that was a terrible mistake. The lie is that Hamas does represent the Palestinians. Not only does it represent them in kind of the general sense that they were elected and that they're Palestinians, and like the Palestinian Authority says, having refused to condemn October 7th, they say they're part of the Palestinian fabric, which is true. But it's deeper than that. Hamas represents, again, what I've come to call Palestinianism, the ideology, the identity that is unfortunately common to nearly every Palestinian, a singular obsession with the non-existence of the Jewish state. Hamas is merely the most brutal executor of that, perhaps the most successful to date, but they represent the deepest Palestinian ethos that whenever you're faced with a choice, you can rule Gaza for the benefit of your people. You can turn it into the pearl of the Mediterranean. You actually make the choice to use that piece of land literally as a launching pad to destroy the Jewish state, or at least to attempt that. So Hamas represents the deepest Palestinian ethos, which is why on October 7th, you had euphoria. And the euphoria wasn't breaking out of prison. Now they have all these images. I'm sure I've seen them on Twitter. Gaza was so beautiful. Yeah. Look at what they destroyed. So it's always like that. They'll tell you one lie, and then that lie will be revealed, and then they'll have another lie. So the lie was it's an open-air prison. Now it's revealed, and now it's genocide. But it's always lies. But the euphoria you had on October 7th wasn't because they were breaking out of prison. They would have gone into the border with Egypt. The euphoria was because they finally saw the vision of return. You actually have videos of people saying, we are returning, this is happening. Mm-hmm. So as far as they were considered, Hamas was executing what they wanted for decades.
So, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I follow Einat Wolf because, she is become, even before the war, she really, Hasbara, very, very involved in the Hasbara efforts to kind of try to whitewash Israeli policy and to give it excuses. She's so wrong on so many levels. It's hard to think about where to start. But one thing that I often find myself mentioning to people, especially people who in the beginning of the war, there was this effort to kind of compare Hamas to ISIS. And I think that, that was warranted in a sense. But the same people who wanted to compare Hamas to ISIS, almost like Einat Wolf, and basically what she's saying here is something that's very similar to what, Bezalel Smotrich is saying. And it's funny because she is, a self, described atheist peace advocate, but really she is endorsing the same views of, Bezalel Smotrich, I think maybe a month or so after October 7th, went into a press conference and said, the Palestinian, the Hamas, the Fatah, they're all the same. The Arabs are the same Arabs, and the sea is the same sea that they want to throw us into. The fact that Palestinians, or what they call Palestinianism, will not accept the Zionist narrative and will see themselves as victims, see themselves as refugees being driven from their homes unfairly, and believe that they have a right to go back to their home. For her, that basically just means they're all Hamas. and they all, and she has prescribed cutting off humanitarian aid and basically starving people to death unless they take an oath that they, renounce their, their views, self identification as refugees, and the irony is that, and getting back to the ISIS analogy, is the counterterrorism goal towards the strategy towards defeating ISIS was to separate them from the local population. And that's how they also, they tried as hard as they could to evacuate Mosul. And then they went in to fight ISIS, and it just in general was to basically to separate the civilian population from ISIS, and to bring an alternative government, like the Iraqi government, or Kurdish controlled areas that set up systems of government after banishing and defeating ISIS in parts of Syria. And here you have the exact opposite approach from someone like Einat Wilf, who is basically saying, hey, like, and what's what Biden was trying to say? He was like saying, hey, there's the Palestinians and there's Hamas. And what we need to do is we need to push them in opposite directions. We need to pull the Palestinians away from supporting Hamas. And whether or not, the extent of Hamas support, and in Gaza, the polling right before the war started was that most Palestinians don't support Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But she's trying to conflate it. She's saying, well, there's this fundamental ethos that Palestinians have, that they really don't like Israel, and they're really, they wish that Israel would didn't exist, which, like, I understand, like, of course Palestinians wish Israel didn't exist. Are they willing to come to terms with Israel, or are they gonna fight until the death against Israel? That's the difference, I think, between Palestinians who join Hamas and Palestinians who don't join Hamas. And what she's trying to do is she's trying to conflate them. They're all the same. If they have this fundamental belief that Israel is illegitimate, then it's that's what we have to defeat. We have to re-educate them. We have to fight them. And so what she's basically saying is, like, we have to view them as one kind of solid unified Palestinianism, and that is just that serves Hamas's interest the same way, because it shows that it's like a zero-sum game, and that there's really there's no alternative. It's just us or them, and they have to completely come to terms with us, and we have to we're not trying to separate the ones who Palestinians from Hamas. We're just viewing them all as one. Yeah.
So I have this other clip, and I really wanted your opinion on this, because this question of what the Palestinians believe in stuff it's a very central one. From an American point of view, I will say the anti-Israel protests after October 7th, it is just true that, except for a handful, there's no mention of the hostages. There's really no talk of two-state solution. And they're handing out flyers like at Columbia with a boot crushing a Star of David, and says "Crush Zionism." And so it's not. So this question of what the Palestinians believe is a central one. And here's this clip. I really want you to respond to this one.
So for me, the moment was when Arafat walks away from a clear and concrete opportunity to have a state of Palestine, no occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites. Good that President Clinton finally spoke up. because our prime ministers kind of let it slide. So it was on the table. It's on the table in 2000, Arafat walks away. It's on the table in 2008, Abu Mazen walks away. Now, what was interesting to me in both instances is that not only did they walk away, there were no dissenting voices, none. You did not even see some third-grade Palestinian activist living in London, in case you want to claim that there's a problem to do so in Gaza or the West Bank, who wrote an op-ed, right, in some small paper that said, what's going on? Are you crazy? We're on the verge of getting everything we've wanted. Go back there and get us our state. So sometimes people like to make excuses, part of West planning, and they say, look, Palestinians can't really speak up. It's a tyrant society and all that. I'm like, oh, they spoke up. There was plenty of dissent in Palestinian society against Arafat, against Abu Mazen for daring to negotiate. But when they walked away, there was no criticism, which means that both Arafat in 2000 and Abu Mazen in 2008, in walking away from a clear and concrete opportunity to have a state, they knew they were fulfilling their people's wishes.
First of all, is that true?
No. In short, no. I mean, listen, the truth of the matter is what she's describing with Arafat walking away from the offer. There's dissent within Israel. I mean, you can read Amiai Alon's description of the Camp David summit, and he basically, there are a lot of people were telling, basically there was this process, and it was, again, there were problems along the way, and Netanyahu was elected in 1996. And led the country through the Oslo process, after having run a campaign basically promising to roll back as much as possible. And there were things that actually worked in the late 1990s. The cooperation between the Palestinian security forces and the Israeli security forces was very, very tight and very, very effective, and prevented a lot of terrorist attacks. Wasn't 100%, but basically, they were reaching the end of the 5-year interim period, and they were supposed to kind of make progress. But basically, Ehud Barak kind of really pushed for this summit, which was basically swinging for the fences, because the incremental progress that they wanted to make over those past 5 years, they didn't make it. Again, partially, part of that period of time, Netanyahu was president and was prime minister, and he explicitly wanted to, minimize the progress of the Oslo process. But the truth of the matter is that, like, this portrayal of Ehud Barak's offer and Camp David as this, like, giving the Palestinians everything they wanted is just completely not true. And it's demonstrably so by the fact that a few months after Palestinian and Israeli negotiators got together and kind of restarted the negotiations in Taba in Egypt, and the Israeli negotiating team made a much more generous offer than what they had in Camp David. And the reason that those negotiations fell apart was not because anyone walked away. What was just because Clinton lost the election and left office, and also Barak lost the election. And Likud Prime Minister Ariel Sharon just said, no more. Like,
but is it true what she claims, that when Arafat walked away, and I know some people might dispute that no Palestinian said, "What are you doing?" Is that true?
I don't, I'm really not an expert on this, on what's exactly happened in terms of that. I think that people had a lot of deference for he was a singular unifying, leader, and he had the credentials of being kind of fighting against Israel, and that's kind of definitely when he led the Palestinians towards laying down their arms and negotiating and coexisting side by side with Israel, there was definitely dissent. But I know if you look at the polls, there's polling from those years, from the Oslo years, and his approach was overwhelmingly popular. The idea that Israel and Palestine and a Palestinian state would exist side by side was overwhelmingly popular. It would take me 5 minutes. I've looked at those polls from Khalil Shikaki's, and those are numbers. Those are numbers that are respected, and I think that there are other polling sources. But even after the Second Intifada, there were years where the vast majority of Palestinians supported a two-state solution. And so, whether or not they thought that Arafat, it wasn't, the portrayal that like the Palestinians got everything they wanted in any round of negotiations. Because also, by the way, in 2008, the other round of negotiations he was referring to, that was, that was also a lame duck president, Prime Minister Olmert under, investigation for corruption, and ultimately went to jail.
Don't you think they made a mistake with Olmert not meeting him, sort of?
They met with him.
Well,
listen,
they didn't embrace the deal.
They met with him. They met with him. I've read a report saying that Tzipi Livni went over to Abbas and said, "Hey, don't sign a deal with him because he has no legitimacy. He's just He's just trying to salvage his government because he's under investigation. He's going to be out of power soon. Wait until we have an opportunity for a new government to come in to power, and we can actually make some progress." And so, but he never walked away. He never said, "Hey, like, no." It was like it was a process that didn't play itself out. It wasn't like a summit. There was no there was no
but yeah,
it wasn't like Camp David. But if Ehud Olmert, if Tzipi Livni wins the 2009 election instead of Netanyahu, it's a different story. Maybe it would have been but from what I understand, that was basically what was going on. And people have, I'm not an expert on it, but the fact of the matter is, Abbas, it's not like he never he spent his entire political career after that cooperating with the Israeli security forces to fight terrorism inside the West Bank. And he went on every single stage around the world saying that he's willing to negotiate, to continue negotiating. So the minutia of what exactly happened, in 2008 on the last months of Olmert's and what it's just irrelevant. And to try to focus and build your whole ideology about and your whole approach of what do Palestinians think, as opposed to like looking at the data and looking at the trends and looking at public opinion over large periods of time, it's ridiculous.
I'm genuinely asking this because I'm trying to figure it out. Since October 7th, have you seen Palestinian voices who said, October 7th and the horrible aftermath in Gaza, I think we need to reconsider some things. We got to stop, with these fantasies that we're going to conquer Tel Aviv, and let's just have our state. Let's live in peace next to Israel. I haven't seen a lot of those. I haven't seen a lot of that. Have you?
I have. First of all, I've seen actually some numbers around two-state solution that have been surprisingly high. Like I saw a poll like a week or two ago that showed like 40% of Palestinians still believe in two-state solution, which was like twice as much as the Israelis. So twice as like so it like it was like 20% of Israelis still believe that's an outcome. So what's the alternative is indefinite military domination of Palestinians. So yeah, there's not a lot of Israelis who are saying, okay, let's have peace alongside. There are much more Palestinians, according to the poll that I saw, who are willing to still support a vision of Israel and Palestinians living side by side. Now, I think that in terms of I think if you put that against the number of the support for or the justification for October 7th, I think that those two things are, again, they're not completely incompatible. You could be a Palestinian who says, hey, you know, I believe that ultimately we're going to have to compromise and live side by side with Israel, but diplomacy isn't getting there. We were just getting completely, railroaded by Israel, just expanding settlements and pushing us to the side of history. All these Gulf regimes were completely ignoring us because they don't give a shit about us. And the only way we were able to get the Palestinian cause back on the table is through violence, and therefore we justify and we support Hamas's attack. And again, I think that a lot of Palestinians live in a complete alternative reality in which they don't see the atrocities that Hamas carried out, or they don't think that it's real, or they think that Israel exaggerated. And I think, by the way, a lot of the things, things that were, make it easier for that kind of atrocity denial to happen was that there were a lot of things that Israeli propagandists said in the beginning, in the months after October 7th, about, beheaded babies and things like that just were just simply not true. So, again, it's morally unjustifiable, what Hamas did, but I think that we have created the circumstances in which, when Palestinians look at what has moved the needle for them in terms of advancing their cause, because we have for so long, and really since 2008, since Netanyahu came to power in 2009, there has never not been any progress and any willingness to make progress on the Israeli side. All there's been is settlement expansion, delegitimization, defunding. You look at it, and this is coming back to what I said in the beginning. Israel turned a blind eye to a international financing operation. They shut down the branch of the Mossad who was responsible for monitoring and uncovering sources of terrorist financing.
Smotrich said, Hamas
they're
is
an
to
asset,
our
right?
asset.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Hamas, and so the Palestinian peaceful Palestinian national liberation has been an abject failure. And so again, I think this is horrible. And I think that this is, and certainly justifying the atrocities that Hamas did is abhorrent. And I think it's extremely, it doesn't help their cause that Palestinians are whitewashing this or defending this or justifying this internationally. And I don't think it's everybody. I don't think all Palestinians are justifying it. But the fact is that Hamas succeeded in bringing the Palestinian issue back to the table, back into international attention, back to it. I think before October 7th, maybe the Saudis would have normalized with Israel without commitment to a Palestinian state. But Palestinian cause, through the suffering that they've been through, has become something that is a global rallying cry, and it's something that generations of Arabs around the Middle East care about. It's something that it's deeply the relationships with Israel that all these dictatorships have, these regimes in the Gulf, they're deeply unpopular because the Israel has become, because of the way Israel waged this war. We're creating this. What I'm trying to say is we've created the circumstances where violence has been the only thing that has moved the needle for Palestinians, and that's why I'm not surprised that that the Palestinians aren't like, hey, why don't we pursue negotiations? Because like you said yourself, the people who have said like let's coexist with Israel, let's negotiation, have been like these buffoons that are completely what's the word, feeble and feckless and just have nothing to show for themselves.
I'm arguing against myself because, as I told you, I was for a pretty dovish response to October 7th. What do you what, but people say this, and I think it's a valid question. Doesn't there have to be some consequence for October 7th? I mean, it is true. This is Israel does not, you know, its neighbors are not Sweden and Finland. This is a pretty brutal region where people, if you're, you know, what's the saying? Like if you're not strong, you get eaten or whatever. Doesn't there have to be a price of some sort after October? That there's a problem, some people say, in having these clashes and stuff, and then it all goes, it's like a video game, and it all restarts. There's no costs, and so it incentivizes more of this. What do you think?
I don't know, like incentivizes. I mean,
Like, do you need to at least
listen, I
yeah.
think that the incentivization for October 7th is the dynamic that we just described. I mean, the incentive was created before October 7th by, you know, creating the circumstances in which nothing has worked for Palestinians working to, you know, Palestinians pursuing diplomacy, you know, trying to get international intervention, trying to do nonviolent forms of resistance and solidarity building have been demonized, called anti-Semitic, called diplomatic terrorists, and they've had their funding shut off. Meanwhile, the you know, Hamas was getting paychecks. You know, Netanyahu, you know, sent the head of the Mossad to Qatar to beg them to continue to fund Hamas because Hamas was an asset. So the incentive for being violent was beforehand. I think that the consequence of the attack, if, you know, again, I'm not somebody who's a pacifist. I don't believe, you know,
Right.
that Israel shouldn't defend itself and to fight against Hamas. And I think, of course, that, you know, armed groups threatening physical violence against Israel need to be fought against. However, the way to fight against them is can't just be through military force, and it's not even like it's a missing piece, like an alternative political horizon, creating some kind of alternative system of governance to replace Hamas. That it's not like it's a nice thing to have or it's a missing part of the puzzle. If you use military violence without creating an alternative system of government after you use the violence, it actually undermines all of the success that you had. Because what you do is I mean, this is what Israel basically did. They destroyed every system, every institution in Gaza, except for Hamas, because they are the ones who have a monopoly on power. And, you know, they destroyed the healthcare system. They destroyed the education system, the universities. There's no running water. There's no, you know, electricity. And people are completely dependent on Hamas. They've consolidated Hamas's rule almost. And so, you know, so like, what's the result? Like, do you think Hamas feels like they're any worse off? They're much more popular in the West Bank. The fact that Abbas continues to collaborate with Israel after all that Israel has done to, you know, slaughter tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, you know, it's even weakened him more. You know, listen, I think that there are a lot of people, I'm sure that there are Palestinians who are saying, hey, you know, like, I can't believe that this is what they did. But those Palestinians are probably the ones who weren't going to be in Hamas to begin with. You know, like, do you think that any Hamas, like, you think that Hamas fighters are like repenting because we've destroyed Gaza and they're like, oh, I guess, it's just, I think, like, you have to think about this in terms of like, what is going to get you closer towards your goal of being secure. And you know, without any kind of alternative system of government that you're going to replace Hamas with, ultimately it's going to be counterproductive.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the thoughtful conversation.